I realise that I have the difficult postprandial slot. What I want to do in the next 15 minutes is convince you that my obsession with diagnostics is absolutely valid. It's been the last 30 years of my career. But I will allow, if there are some extra long blinks, I'll understand, and we won't be quizzing you for questions. So I thought I'd begin with Hippocrates, one of the founding believed to be one of the founding fathers of modern medicine. Health is our most valuable possession. And I stand here saying that as someone that's suffering from a cold, and I really wish I felt better. And I don't remember when I felt better, even though it was only 2 days ago. So I'm going to take you through why diagnostics is important in the healthcare journey, and some examples of how we develop the clinical evidence behind those. First challenge. Mine's changed, but that one hasn't. Ta-da! There we go. So a bit about me and why I'm standing here. So I have worked in the world of in vitro diagnostics for the last 30 years. I stepped into a bijou porter cabin at the side of the car park in Bedford Hospital in the late 90s as a trainee chemical pathologist. And I did it because my mum and dad didn't really want to pay full price for university, and they realised the NHS would support me. But what did actually happen is that I realised that diagnostics really is the key to the patient pathways and delivering better healthcare outcomes. So NHS trained and now an industry expert, and I deliver that expertise through Lehane Consulting, but I also support BIVDA as a scientific advisor. So BIVDA, established in 1992, are one of the voices of the industry in the UK and also support international diagnostic distributors and manufacturers. And what BIVDA aim to do as a trade association is to really champion and help shape policy around the use of diagnostics within the NHS and private medicine. So diagnostics, we describe it as the quiet engine of the NHS. So we use diagnostics to guide decisions, to prevent harm, and also to empower patients, which is really important. And it's an important starting point for that diagnostic journey. So let me give a bit of an overview of the current landscape to help you understand what's driving diagnostic development at the moment. So, of course, we know we have an ageing population. Back in 1948, when the NHS was first established, 1 in 2 people died before the age of 67. And now, in present day, that's more like 1 in 7. But unfortunately, again, as we know, people are not living longer in a healthy mindset and a healthy body. They're actually living with many different healthcare conditions that are challenging them. In terms of life expectancy, which is one of the key indicators of a healthy population, a 65-year-old man now, today, can expect to live for another 18 and a half years. And it also depends on where you're born and raised. So in Blackpool, for example, your average life expectancy is 55.3 years. In the Orkney Islands, it's 75 years. So those social determinants of health are key to helping our population to live the best life that they can live. In terms of the prevalence of chronic conditions, 1 in 3 adults that are admitted to A&E in the UK in the present day have 5 or more comorbidities. And I think that's huge when we think about that. And we're, of course, now using the word multimorbidities because there's not many people in the population that don't have only one comorbidity. So diabetes, mental health, COPD, hypertension, all of those are adding into this landscape of why we need diagnostic testing. Of course, we have great innovation and great technology that's helping us, but we need to utilize those ideas and capture those. And I put early intervention on there because we know it goes without saying that the sooner you diagnose, the sooner you can actually help and get the patient on the right pathway that they need. The COVID pandemic was actually really beneficial for the diagnostics industry. It's where we really were able to come into our own and able to show the wider population why diagnostics are important. So from small school children to the elderly population, everyone was trying out a diagnostic test at home and understanding there are good tests and bad tests, but vitally, they can help us. In the Lancet in 2021, so when we were first reflecting on what we had done well during the pandemic and what hadn't gone quite so well, there was a paper that talked about the fact that actually 50% of the world population have little or no access to high quality diagnostics. And if we actually look into the low and low middle income countries, that number raises to 81%. So it's not enough to have good quality diagnostics. They have to be accessible to everyone that needs them and deserves them. So why are diagnostics so important? 300,000 tests performed every single working day across labs in the United Kingdom. And a statistic that all diagnostic companies love to quote is that 70% of clinical decisions are influenced by diagnostic tests. Bearing in mind that was from a paper in 2017, so we're pretty sure that goes up into the 80s and 85% by now. 95% of clinical pathways rely on patients having access to pathology services. So it's not enough just to have a test that might be available, it has to be used. And I've been in appointments with my father, who is a poorly controlled diabetic, and they've talked to him about sending him away to have his blood taken for a HbA1c, whilst there are point-of-care machines sat at the side of the room gathering dust. So you have to use those tests as well as have access to them. And 50 million reports are sent from the labs to the GPs each year. So it's a huge amount of information we're collecting from patients, and we're able to use them. I chose blood because out of all the bodily fluids, blood is my favourite. I'm sure you all have your own personal favourite, but I love blood and everything you can do with it. And I wanted to really illustrate here the journey that we've been on in blood collection. So you can see the lady on the left-hand side really not enjoying having the blood collected from her arm, and it's taking at least 3 what we hope to be trained healthcare professionals collecting. We've then moved very quickly into capillary blood, and we know that in the last few years we've gathered great data that shows that capillary blood is comparable to venous blood, and that makes it much easier to test in the home and test in the community, and also for patients to be able to test themselves. And we also got the higher volumes now being able to be collected from the arm. If anyone's ever tried one of these devices that then allows you to either send that blood sample away through a postal service or to deliver it to your nearest testing centre. So what makes the perfect biomarker when we're thinking about in vitro diagnostics? So biological markers defined really by those that have a characteristic feature that's either increased or decreased in relation to a medical state. And obviously it goes without saying that they must be specific to the disease you're looking for, and they also need to be sensitive. So when we think about true positives and true negatives, for the negatives, that's the number of people who don't have the condition that test negative. And I think sensitivity and specificity were much talked about during the pandemic, but I would hasten to add, still not fully understood by the wider scientific population. But where we want to look really is that the tests that are being used are accurate, that they are reproducible, not just in the same patient, but across the patient groups, but also that we don't accept tests that are not accurate. If we think about over-the-counter tests that are available for patients to self-select and use at home, we know that there are tests available on the high street that really are not good enough and have not been through vigorous testing. And one of the things at BIVDA in particular that we look at trying to do is raising awareness in consumers that they need to question and make sure those products have a CE mark and that those products have good clinical evidence behind them. When we also think about perfect biomarkers, we must think about the clinical utility. And this is the ability for those tests to help in leading clinical decision making and the clinical actions that the healthcare professionals take. And this then will help to improve patient pathways, improve patient outcomes, and also studies have shown that by using a good test with your patient understanding what you're measuring, it helps to improve that patient-doctor relationship as well. Accessibility and cost effectiveness, we've talked a little bit about accessibility, but the cost-effective bit is also really worth highlighting, because one of the challenges we find in diagnostics is when we're trying to bring an innovative test into a healthcare pathway, we are faced with the challenge that that test costs more than what's currently being done. It's very frustrating, and it's very difficult for us to be able to form the argument that actually shows by spending a little bit more, you're having better outcomes. So the health economics around the use of good diagnostic tests is a piece that's vital. So then the evidence and the clinical evidence that we need and why we need it. So the in vitro diagnostics directive has moved to become the in vitro diagnostics regulation. So that was brought into force in 2022. And as an industry, we're still seeing those impacts taking shape. But what IVDR does very nicely is clearly lay out what we need to do and how and why. So in terms of the evidence development that we need to perform in order to bring a diagnostic test to market, there are various components that we need to make sure that we have the data and that we have the evidence to show that the test does what it says it does in the labeling. And the clinical evidence components all ladder up to support the intended use or the intended purpose statement of those tests. So when we think about analytical performance, this is the ability for that test to correctly detect the analyte that it's supposed to be detecting. And it sounds simple, but there are tests that have been launched onto the market that don't have that. And it's a huge piece, and it's onerous for the diagnostic test manufacturers and expensive, but it's really important that each test has that pathway and that data mapped. Scientific validity is where we have to show the analyte associating with the clinical condition. So showing that that marker is raised or lowered or changes within a clinical condition. So obviously that study has to be carried out in the population that's correct for that marker, but also making sure that you have representation of that group. And clinical performance, they're the last of the three, which is the ability to yield results that are correlated to the condition. So when the patient starts on the treatment or therapy pathway that they need, it's making sure that the marker goes up and down as you would expect and that you're able to track and monitor that. So to reflect this in one slide is very difficult, but essentially it's a huge undertaking, but a really important part of the development of new diagnostic tests. So in closing, the first thing to say is, as we all know, the future is very exciting, but I wanted to just talk about a few things that are coming our way that are already on the horizon for the world of in vitro diagnostics and more, but also things that we hope to see as we progress. So the future is, of course, now, and digital biomarkers is a huge part of this future. So any device that can collect objective, quantifiable measures of health or disease, and I think there's probably most people in this room have a smartwatch or an Aura ring or the new Aura earrings, if you've seen them, that are constantly monitoring and collecting data. Now, that's really important for thinking about information about your own health. You know, we've tracked steps for many years, but being able to track heart rate, being able to track how your behavior changes according to what you're collecting. And that constant monitoring is giving us much more information to work on in the world of diagnostics, so we can then develop companion diagnostics alongside that. And that real-time feedback is important for then allowing us to predict what might happen and to be able to track trends and detect patterns. what you see on this slide is pictures of all the different settings that in vitro diagnostics can be used in. So not just in the hospital setting, but now, as we saw in the NHS 10-year plan, moving into the community. And that's with healthcare professionals helping patients in their home, but also patients testing themselves and collecting that data. And the last point I have on there is the patient part. And actually, arguably, it's probably the most important. So there was a study that showed that patients who saw their doctors using tests were more likely to ask questions and want to understand more about what those tests were doing. And it's really important that when we develop new diagnostic products, we're thinking about the patients that they're going to have the impact upon. So I hope that I've been able to convey a small amount of my enthusiasm for the world of diagnostics. I'm still pretty obsessed with it and would happy to talk further in the break. But now I think we've got a few minutes for hopefully some questions. Anywhere that you saw a QR code on my slides links you to the paper. And, you know, we all saw the Lancet article about fake and sham publications. I only use non-sham publications, but that will take you straight to the paper. And if it's freely accessed, you'll get the full copy. But by all means, drop me a note if you want any of the references I've talked about today. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Thank you for a lovely presentation, Lucy. I was wondering, so some biomarkers are highly variable, you know, and over the day we might have changes in expression of a particular protein, for example. Is there any preference for biomarkers or a test that actually lasts your whole lifetime, like a genetic test, versus something that's quite variable and influenced by different factors?
Preference for in development?
Yeah, or sort of actual approval as a diagnostic.
No, there's no preference. I mean, I would say from a commercial perspective in the diagnostic world, if we can find a test that someone needs to do every hour of their day, that's perfect. But also during that section of clinical evidence that I showed there with the kind of tree diagram, one of the things we have to do as developers is make sure that we capture those variations within the studies that we structure, and particularly for things with diurnal rhythm, as you say. I spent a lot of my career working in HCG in pregnancy. And in the early days of pregnancy testing, we would say to women that, you know, they had to use the first early morning urine, because that's when we knew HCG was most concentrated. And over time, we did studies to show that actually we could improve the test so that it actually made it easier for the woman to test whenever she wanted to test. So I think recognizing that the biomarkers may behave differently is a key part. And what the clinical evidence piece does is make sure that as manufacturers and developers, we understand the marker inside and out before the test is launched. Yeah, thank you.
Got time for one more? If there are any? Or I will. Thank you.
So, Lucy, you mentioned about the diabetes testing, and there were point-of-care tests that weren't used. Do you know what the main obstacles are sometimes for these tests that get bought? I mean, it's a general question, but can you comment on why some tests are kind of bought in but not used clinically?
The one I'm filtering before I'm answering. Cost is a huge one. Not wanting to change the way, it's that culture, the way we do things around here. I'll share with you my favourite reason that I was given by a GP surgery. They didn't have a plug socket to plug it in. So I think in the world of diagnostics, we're very frustrated because we know how good these tests are and the impact that they can have. So we spend an awful lot of our time helping potential customers to understand the benefits, but it's cost, it's pathway, it's, for example, if you're trying to bring a cardiac marker test into the emergency room, the cost would be borne in the ED department because they would be the department that buys the test, but the cost benefit would actually be seen further down that pathway because you wouldn't then admit that patient into a ward, you wouldn't maybe send them off to a secondary level hospital for more testing. So and that's where the health economics to really prove and demonstrate the worth of the test as well as the value.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.